The sky never remembers how to be soft anymore. It sits like a bruise over the world, a constant copper-baked dome that cooks the horizon and steals the memory of blue. When it storms, the rain is thin and sharp, salt-laced and full of ash. When it doesn't, the wind comes carrying a taste of rust and rot. We measure time now by the cadence of dust, how it settles on a window, how long before a boot print is erased, how much grit clogs the throat. The catastrophe began slowly enough that most of us still called it a string of bad years. Then the string snapped. Rivers that had fed whole regions shrank into gutters of cracked clay. Reservoirs went from gleaming mirrors to open wounds. Concrete skins split. Algae blooms baked into brittle mosaics. The Great Lakes receded like retreating giants and left behind a stink of dead fish and a ring of exposed pylons. Farmlands that once rose green as breath turned sepia and then bone white. The topsoil, starved of rain and life, blew away on the next high wind. Where cornfields used to whisper, now there are only the soft, intermittent groans of weathered irrigation pipes. Cities we used to recognize have become topographical jokes. Highways loop into dust plains and end at half-submerged overpasses. Glass towers stand like the ribs of something vast and dead, their facades scored with heat cracks, their elevators frozen in the places where people last fled. The downtowns that used to hum with delivery trucks and neon have become scavenger mazes. Storefronts gutted, shelves picked clean of last year's flour, playgrounds filled with sand and rust. Bridges collapsed under their own neglect or under the weight of desperate migrants. Suburbs have fossilized. Lawns are fields of dead dandelions and stray plastic. Mailboxes hang off their posts like broken teeth. Coastlines tell a different kind of story. Some shores swallowed whole neighborhoods with rising water and furious storms. Others hardened into salt flats where tide pools have gone acidic and fish no longer spawn. The sea took its share, and on the other side of the ledger, the land gave up its water to the sky that refused to rain. Law and order became regional myths. The centralized governments that pretended to be omnipotent dissolved into bureaucratic fossils, proclamations posted, never enforced. Where state authority crumbled, new powers emerged from whatever muscle, guns, or cunning people still had. There are enclaves now, ringed with sandbags and solar arrays, where something like governance persists. Ration cards stamped in faded ink, nurses who trade wound dressings for canned meat, old teachers who run lessons on how to purify what little water they can find. Most of these pockets are fragile arrangements, held together by mutual dependence and thinly veiled fear. Outside the enclaves, society runs on barter and rumor. Water is currency. Bullets buy bread in some places. Clean fuel buys a month of safe sleep in others. Convoys, some communal, many predatory, move like vultures along former interstate arteries, stopping at broken gas stations and shuttered supermarkets. The scavengers are as diverse as the ruins. Teenagers who can slip through a fence and beat a rusting alarm. Old men who remember where a municipal pump used to be. Women who trade sewing skills for a bottle of iodine. Then there are the raiders, well-armed, organized, and merciless. They call themselves protectors in the daylight and extorters after dusk. Survivalist enclaves and faith-based communes dot the landscape, each with their own rights and rules. Some cling to the old flags and old ways. Others have adopted brutal new codes where strength makes the law, and the weak are encouraged to move on. A few seed banks, once repositories of hope, sit behind concrete and wire, their vaults either intact and hoarded, or corrupted by mold and neglect. Libraries became practical again for a while. Universities transformed into archives and clinics, and in rare cases, power hubs for nearby communities. Hospitals exist in name, but most have become clinics that stitch and trim and delay the inevitable. Communication is patchwork. Satellite networks are spotty and expensive. Some satellites still drift and send down half-formed signals, but few people can afford to talk. Where radio survives, it is the bloodline of memory. Old broadcast towers, once proud and clean, now grown under improvised antennas and patched transmitters. A handful of stations transmit with solar arrays and bicycle generators, sending out voices into the static, calls for trades, for medicine, for lost family. Those voices stitch together distant strangers into something like a public square. Often it is not news they bring, but the litany of what was lost and what can be offered. A jug of rainwater, a rusted bike pump, a prayer. The climate has become an antagonist with a long memory. Heat waves last for weeks and arrive with a lethargic certainty that saps willpower as easily as it does breath. Wildfires run like a rumor through the tinder of a dry landscape, eating fence lines and small towns before anyone has time to blink. Dust storms are the new winter. They arrive sudden and mean, blotting out the sun, filling lungs with glass sonde that lingers in the throat for days. And the nights, when they come, are sharp and cold, as if the world tucks its wounds away and forgets to heal. We move differently now. We travel at dawn to avoid the heat. We sleep under tarps that smell faintly of diesel. We measure our belongings by how many trips it takes to carry them. We remember the old maps and laugh at how useless they are, roads rerouted by collapse, towns relocated, names changed or erased. Still, we keep maps. Habits die harder than buildings. That's the landscape I walk through and send reports about. The world I try to name into a microphone so someone, somewhere, will know we are still here. There is no grand finale yet, only the steady, grinding negotiation between what we were and what we must become. And beneath the noise, in the gaps between the generators and the whispers of those who still tend gardens in broken lots, there is a small, stubborn expectation. If you keep listening, something might answer. My name is Miles Harrington. Once that name fit a man who commuted across a glass river of highways to an office with humming fluorescents and an almost obscene abundance of coffee. Now it fits a voice that creeps through the static at odd hours, a crank of warmth on someone else's cold night. I keep a microphone warm because the world needs to be spoken to, if only so the dead city remembers there were people here who mattered. I live where a church used to sit, its steeple broken like a punctuation mark against the copper sky. We took the pews out and bolted them into shelves. The sanctuary is my studio and my armory. Beneath the raised floor, I dug a cistern from the old foundation and sealed it with tarps and clay. Rain is a rumor, not a guarantee, but when it comes I catch it. The cistern feeds a hand pump and 3 enamel kettles. I treat what I can't boil with bleach measured in drops. A rule learned the day a bottle of iodine ran out and my neighbor coughed for a week. If the radio signal matters, water matters more. Survival is narrower than dignity. It is a list of small, urgent acts performed without romance. I ration fuel like sacred scripture. A pint of diesel for the generator every 5 days at most, 2 lights on timers, 1 heater for the cold snaps. Mostly we run off the sun, a pair of battered panels scavenged from a school roof, and an inverter rigged to charge a bank of lead-acid batteries. When the batteries fail, we pedal. A bicycle rigged to a belt drive alternator gives me an hour of broadcast for every 15 minutes of sweat. People call it a miracle. I call it math. Food is a ledger of work and memory. I have a chest full of cans, corn, beans, stew, some labeled with dates that predate the collapse. I stretch those cans with foraged greens and the small vegetables we coax from the rooftop beds. We are 2 rows of lettuce, a patch of chard, a stubborn tomato vine that blooms in defiance of the heat. In spring, I trade radio time for a sack of heirloom seeds and a lesson on compost. We layer cardboard and straw and kitchen scraps until the soil acts like a throat that will drink. I trap rabbits with simple snares along the dry creek bed, fish with a line where the water pools, and smoke what we can't eat immediately. Salt is a currency, and sugar is a luxury. Preservation is the quiet hero of every long night. Medicine is improvisation and memory. I learned sutures from an old EMT manual I kept because I liked the pictures. I clean wounds with boiled water and hibiscus tea if I can spare it. The tannins help stop bleeding. Aspirin and antibiotics are rationed like family heirlooms, given only to the people who keep the place going. We barter a course of pills for a week of help repairing a solar junction or replacing a pump. No one plays hero when the fever takes a child. We are realists. Sterile gauze, clean hands, and hope. Security is ritual and paranoia. We left the doors unhinged at first, believing in common decency. The first winter taught humility. Now, tripwires made from fishing line and tin cans tacked to the fence sing before someone reaches the gate. Mirrors on poles at the tree line catch approaching light and give us a minute's warning. We run nightly watches and rotate the shifts like sleep itself is part of the defense. When I sleep, I keep a small pack by the bed. A knife, 2 water-purifying tablets, a bandana, a pistol whose rounds I count each morning. I never thought I'd inventory bullets like photographs, but here they are evidence of a time when we assumed the worst. I am not alone in this church. I am a steward. There are 3 others who keep the place practical. Hannah, who tends the garden and keeps a ledger of who owes what. Ramon, who is a scavenger and can coax a working pump out of trash. And Elise, who once taught 3rd grade and now teaches anyone who will listen how to stitch a wound or mend a torn canvas. They keep me human. They keep me honest. When the generator hums and I take the mic, I am not speaking for myself alone. I am a mouthpiece for their trades, their fears, their jokes. I am the place where their names are spoken into the air. Before the collapse, my family fit into a photograph on the mantel. A woman with a laugh like wind through paper, a child with a smudge of jam on his lip, a dog whose head fit into my palm. I lost them in the year the reservoirs cracked. I went looking for them with a convoy that never returned. That pursuit is a hollow ache that tastes of iron. Guilt is a constant companion that wears my boots thin. I count the days by their absence and try to avoid the temptation to catalog how I might have done better. Survival does not absolve. It amplifies the memory. Why I keep going is a tangle of duty and stubbornness. The voice is a promise I made in the early months when everything felt like it could still be saved. I promised to find people, to call out names, to keep a list of who passed through and who stayed. There is a ledger on my desk with names, dates, and the goods traded, small things, but all proof that our lives left traces. I read those names on the air sometimes and people write back. A voice will respond from a place 3 counties over. Still here, 2 left. Need a wrench. That response is oxygen. It tells me the world had not yet decided to stop listening. Broadcasting is also my ritual for sanity. When the transmitter is warming and the needle climbs out of the noise, it narrows the chaos of the day into a single, focused act. Speak, breathe, report. I describe the weather because weather is both community and survival data. Dust storm coming from the west, expect 6 hours of wind. Rain possible tomorrow. I list trade offers and requests. Batteries for sugar, a weekend watch for a bottle of iodine. I tell the odd story because stories stitch people together. I read letters aloud, messages from a kid who found a dead pigeon and wanted to know its age, from an old man who recalled the smell of summer in a place that is now ash. The microphone holds me accountable. I cannot allow myself to dissolve into despair when other people count on the signal to plan their next move. Trust is a currency even more precious than water. I have learned to trust small skills and the immediate proof they provide. If someone can fix my alternator and hooks the belt properly, they earn 2 nights of watch. If someone brings news of a working well, I will send Ramon with tools and ask for photographs. Rumors are a wildfire. Useful facts are a handrail. I am cautious of charity. Too much kindness in an empty world is sometimes a precursor to being taken for more than you can afford. There is a rhythm to grief here, an economy of remembering. I keep a shelf of small objects, a child's shoe, a cracked watch, a postcard with a lighthouse on it. Once a week I read aloud the names of those we lost. I say them slowly, like a prayer that refuses conversion into legend. When the names finish, sometimes the room is too quiet to breathe. Then someone will laugh at a remembered insult, a ridiculous smallness of human vanity, and the silence breaks. Laughter is a small insurgency against despair. Hope in the end is not a thing. It is a project. Hope is the act of patching a solar cable and watching the meter tick up. Hope is drying a tin of beans and adding a sprig of whatever green I could coax out of the terrace. Hope is using the radio to call a stranger's name and hearing their voice answer back. It is the tiny, stubborn belief that if we keep talking and trading and teaching, something accumulates that is not just survival but a fragment of civilization. I do not romanticize what we do. We are tired, and sometimes the tiredness is a slow erosion of will. I have had nights where the generator stutters and I imagine silence spreading like oil. I have held a child whose fever would not break and wondered whether mercy might sometimes be a softer end than a world of scavenged cans and cracked concrete. Still, the mic is warm under my palm, and the static is only sometimes cruel. More often, it is a room full of echoes that means I am not alone. If you tune in and catch my voice, know two things. First, I am careful with promises. If I say there will be a convoy tomorrow, it's because I measured fuel and weather and temperament. Second, if I call your name, if I read it into the static and you answer, hold on to that. The world has taken a lot, but it has not yet stolen the courtesy of reply. Responding is one of the quietest forms of resistance I know. I will keep waking before dawn, checking the panels, measuring the water with the same old dipper, and turning the radio on. I will keep saying the names and reading the ledger. There is no grand plan, no map to the end. There is a litany of small acts: mend, barter, guard, teach, broadcast. That is how we make a life out of what remains. That is how I keep breathing into the microphone and listening for the sound of someone else answering back. We called it the drying at first, an insultingly small word for what arrived. Drying sounded like a shirt left on the line too long. The truth was brutal. The hydrology of the continent changed, and everything that relied on steady water began to unravel like a cheap seam. For 5 seasons the rain came late, then less, then not at all. Rivers shrank into braided threads of puddles and sludge. Wells that had been handed down through families became dusty holes, their ropes frayed and the buckets gone. The reservoirs cracked their skin and bled. The snowpack in the mountains, the slow-release bank that used to pay out water through the thaw, came in handfuls and melted in a single warm blur. With each lost snow year, the taps in 1,000 towns grew thinner. The disaster doesn't come alone. With the drought came heat waves that lasted for weeks and wildfires that jumped the valleys and ate towns whole. With wildfires came ash that made the air taste like a burned photograph and choked lungs until coughing was prayer. Dust storms, once rare, began to take on the schedule of seasons. I have listened to the soil scream. Topsoil, the thin living skin that feeds a hectare of wheat, boiled away into the wind and left the earth to harden into a crust that never breaks the rain even if rain returns. Salt moved where it shouldn't, creeping inland from the coasts where rising seas pushed the groundwater up and mixed the fresh with brine. Where crops did manage to germinate, the heat stressed them into bitter, small things. Yields collapsed. Farmers turned into the new refugees. People reacted the only way people do when the old maps fall apart. They moved, they hoarded, they fought. At first there were convoys, formal, organized attempts by municipalities to move those who could no longer stay. Later, convoys became scavenger lines and then ambush targets. I saw one such convoy break on the highway outside of what used to be a mall. There were little lights strung like defeat over flatbed trailers, and they were out in 10 minutes, raiders in the brush. And the convoy's guards, tired and underarmed, split like a dry branch. I sat in my studio and described it on air because someone listening 3 counties over needed to know that route was hot. A woman called me that night to tell me they changed course because of my warning. That is the thin thread between being a voice and being a dangerous liar. Alliances form and dissolve with startling speed. There is a scavenger syndicate we call the Crows, teenagers hardened by hunger who move at night and take what they can. They aren't organized like armies. They're clever and fast, and worse, they don't carry the weight of old moral arguments. There are enclaves that try to be lawful. One such place has bartered for a diesel pump and runs a queue system for water, an honored list of elders who adjudicate disputes. Then there are the faith brigades, who trade religion for order and promise salvation along with soup. We deal with them all. Some neighbors are life-saving. A woman named Hannah who taught me how to layer compost and how to coax a tomato out of 2 square feet of soil. Others are the sort of people who look at the cistern and calculate what they could take before anyone noticed. Survival gets harder every day for reasons that stack on each other like bad weather. Resources are finite in a way they never felt before. Aquifers have been pumped for decades. Once you pull water out faster than the rain puts it back, recharge stops and the well goes hollow. The old grid of commerce, trucks, refrigerated supply chains, factories, depended on cheap electricity and accessible fuel. When those stop, everything reliant on them frays. Batteries die. Generators sputter on their last pints. The manufacturing that made solar panels and filters shrank and then stopped. Replacement parts simply do not exist in the quantities we need. Skilled labor is a rarer commodity than canned meat. The person who knows how to weld a pipe or recondition an inverter is worth their weight in clean water. Disease rides the disaster as a second wave. Stagnant water breeding bacteria, crowded shelters for refugees, malnutrition making immune systems soft. All of it makes minor infections into killers. We have antibiotics, but they are finite and often expired. Vaccination campaigns stopped when the logistics chain snapped. Diseases we thought under control began to slip back into memory. Mental illness follows physical privation. Despair, chronic anxiety, the numbing grief that loosens people's ability to cooperate. Fuel is the quiet arithmetic of everything. 1 liter for the generator, 1 liter to run the pump. Make the wrong choice, and you are left cold and silent. Fuel caches get raided. People run cars until the engine sees because transportation is the difference between a day of foraging and going hungry. Solar helps when you can keep panels clean and batteries maintained, but dust and sand destroy the delicate chemistry inside lead acid and lithium cells. Panels get scratched by grit and their panels mounts rust. Someone with the skills to tighten a junction is rare, as I said. The environment itself has grown more capricious. The jet stream shifted, they said on the old radios I used to tune in. A wobble that keeps heat domes parked over areas for weeks. When a heat dome sits, evaporation increases exponentially. Plants close their stomata to conserve moisture and stop growing. Rivers shrink. Glacial mass declines. The hydrological balance, a once stable ledger of snow, rain, groundwater, and evaporation, tilted and then tipped. It is not poetic, it is physics. If you want the science in plain terms, higher temperatures mean more water is sucked out of soil and plants into the air. We call that evapotranspiration. The hotter the air, the more moisture it can hold, which often means rain where moist air rises into a cooling region and none where it does not. The patterns of where storms form and where they travel have changed. Climates that used to be reliable are now gamblers. Aquifers, underground reservoirs, recharge slowly. If you pump them too fast, and we did, the water table drops and the ground compacts. You get subsidence, wells go dry, and reclaimed farmland turns into a patchwork of cracked basins. Saltwater intrusion happens when coastal aquifers are lowered and seawater rushes in. The result is soil and water that will no longer grow the crops they once could. Those are the mechanics. The human side is simpler to explain and harder to fix. People hoard because they can see their own children shrink like a bad memory. People lie because lying sometimes protects them. Cooperation seems like a luxury when you can't trade for tomorrow's meal. Leadership is complicated. Leaders who promise order often require sacrifices. We face special immediate threats now. The dust storms can be toxic. Wherever industry once sat, heavy metals and residue rest in the soil. When the wind lifts the soil, it carries more than earth. It carries old poisons. I remember clearing a house where a factory had once stood and finding a halo of ground that tested with lead. I have worn masks the way other people wore rings. Always there, always with me. Toxic rain that has passed through smoky, chemical-laden air and then falls in a weak, acidic trickle, is a risk when wildfires burn through industrial sites or long-dormant chemical stores. When it falls, we shelter, catch, and test. We cannot drink it unless we can distill it. There are also tactical threats. Raiders with heat-hardened rifles, scabies and lice in cramped shelters, the slow theft of morale. A community can be perfectly provisioned and still die because its people stop trusting each other. That internal rot is as lethal as any external attack. What are the tangible limitations I wrestle with every day? Water first. My cistern, patched and lined, holds a month of careful use for 4 people if the weather behaves. Food is a ledger. Canned stores, which are finite, and rooftop beds that can only feed so many mouths. Fuel is counted in teaspoons. Medicine is rationed, and when antibiotics run out, we triage more harshly. Tools wear, and we lack the metallurgy to replace them. Communications run on radios and intermittent satellite relays. When the batteries are dead, so is our network. People with knowledge, the welder, the nurse, the radio tech, cannot be innumerable. We protect them because they are irreplaceable. So what do? We adapt in the small ways the world allows. We reduce consumption to mathematics, shorter cooking times, washing in gray water, sharing generator time. We double-line our water catchment. Every roof in the enclave funnels into 2 cisterns. Overflow is rooted into a planted infiltration swale, so the ground can drink slowly rather than run off and evaporate. We mulch like it's a religion. Thick layers of straw and cardboard hold soil moisture and keep roots cool. We plant in microclimates. Shade where the sun is cruel, deep pits where cooler air pools, and polycultures that mimic old ecosystems rather than monoculture spreadsheets. We save seeds from plants that survive the worst. These hardy descendants slowly breed resilience into the crops we can grow. Actionable steps I say on air when I can, because people need reminders they can use. Boil water if you can, a rolling boil for 1 minute, longer at high elevations kills most pathogens. If you cannot boil, use a mechanical filter rated to 1 micron to remove bacteria and protozoa, and then disinfect. Commercial gravity filters are the gold standard. Where filters are not available, a solar still can distill water, a shallow pit, a container for dirty water, a sheet to funnel condensation into a collection cup. It is slow but reliable. For food, preserve through drying, salting, and smoking. A simple solar dehydrator can be made from a wooden box and glass. For soil, build swales and berms to capture runoff, layer compost, and cover crops to keep roots in the ground. For power, keep panels clean, dust is the enemy, tighten mounts, and protect battery banks from extreme temperatures. In terms of defense, light discipline, early warning systems, mirrors, noisemakers on fence lines, and non-lethal deterrents that keep people from making a lethal decision in panic. Yet advice is not magic. It is work, and work costs time and calories. There are limits to what small communities can scale. The best we can do is assemble networks, small trade loops, mutual aid packs, knowledge exchanges. The radio is the backbone of that network for me. I trade knowledge for supplies. I trade warnings for favors. We cannot rebuild the old economy, but we can build a web of microeconomies that respect local ecologies and do not depend on a faraway factory to send us more parts. Right now, as I speak into the mic, a dust wall is on the horizon. The barometer in my head tells me, wind shift from the west, pressure dropping, birds moving low. We will batten down the cistern covers, seal the vents, and bring the seedlings indoors. Ramon will ride out with the mirror and warn the eastern enclaves. Hannah will gather the last of the lettuce. Elise will sit with the kids and teach a song about conserving breath. This is the central conflict. The environment has gained an upper hand and keeps raising the stakes. The crisis is not a single event but a cascade. Less water, more heat, failing infrastructure, social fracture. Each day the ledger worsens. Another well gone, another convoy lost, another seed vault broken into. Our survival is a calculus with many shifting variables. We are learning to be conservative with probabilities and generous in human terms. If you can, listen for the weather changes. If you are somewhere that still has a garden, double mulch tonight. If you have a battery bank, check the connections and make sure the panels are clear of dust before sundown. If you hear of a convoy, do not assume it is friendly. If I broadcast a route as hot, believe me and alter your plan. And if you have skills, welding, medicine, radio repair, bring them into your circle and teach someone else before you have to leave. Knowledge spreads faster than bullets and lasts longer than canned food. The crisis is a moral test as much as a practical one. We can hoard and lose what is human in us, or we can share what we can and risk being taken. I try to steer people to the second option because the radio has taught me there are other ears out there, other hands that will help. But I do not pretend it is easy. The drought keeps measuring us by our willingness to adapt, and adaptation is hard work done in small, unromantic strokes. A weather note, a trade request, and a name. The name is a lifeline. If someone answers it, everything feels lighter for a minute. If no one answers, we tighten another bolt and keep the generator warm. The crisis has not yet decided whether we will be clever enough, stubborn enough, or kind enough to survive. All we can do is keep doing the small things that add up and hope the ledger tilts back in favor of living. The dust came like a rumor first, a low, distant tick of sand against rust, the way a loose shutter sings before a storm. Then it arrived as a wall, a brown tide rolling across the plain and flattening everything in its path to the same color. We battened down the cistern, sealed the vents, pulled the seedlings into the sanctuary and wrapped them in cloth. That night the generator coughed more than usual. The diesel smelled like the last of the old world. I sat with the meter and the ledger and did the sum. Fuel left for 32 hours of generator time, 7 cans of stew, 2 weeks of rationed water if the pumps didn't fail. The math is never kind. Resources contract like a fist. Food disappears in the same quiet way trust does, small thins at first and then a hole where something used to be. The cans that belonged to me were once a comfort. Now opening one is a small moral decision. Do I eat the beans tonight and give Ramon a spare can for a scavenging run, or do I stretch them across another 2 days? Water rules everything. I learned to listen to the cistern the way I used to listen to people. A hollow sound against the floor when it's nearly empty, a dull thud when it's half full. That night the cistern thudded and said thin. When the rationing rules collide with the human body, the rules bend and people become improvisers. Ramon had been gone for 3 days. He left on a run to the north, where old townships sometimes still hide panels and pipe couplings that can be patched into our rig. He always came back with some battered treasure, a length of hose, a wafered circuit board, stories of roads that had become burial mounds for cars. He also came back with news, and news is lethal when the wrong ears hear it. On his second night after returning, he sat with a tin cup and told us, half laughing and half afraid, that there were whispers of a place called Grayford. The old DeSalle plant, Hannah asked. She pinched the stem of a dried leaf between thumb and finger like counting a debt. Isn't that 3 counties over? That place was military protected before the feeds went down. Ramon took a breath and folded his hands like someone trying to hold a bad thought together. Not the plant, not in the old sense. People said there's a string of panels out by the estuary and a small crew that knows reverse osmosis. They're calling themselves the keepers. They barter water for tools. They got a pump that runs on a solar-driven motor," and he stopped, because there's always an itch with rumor, to make it better or smaller for safety. They can give a community clean water for months if they decide to. Hope is a dangerous thing to put in the hands of rumor. The radio is a needle. A single broadcast can pull a thread through the whole region. I could have kept the news close and sent Ramon quietly with tools and trade, the cautious take. But there is a logic to airing it. If the keepers exist and are hoarding water, communities will eventually collide. If the keepers are real and generous, more of us can survive. If they are a myth, the search will cost us the same either way. I weighed the consequences and decided I would not lie by omission. I did a careful broadcast, a short, balanced read of what Ramon had heard, prefaced with caution and a request for verification, and closed with a call for anyone with concrete knowledge to respond. I got 32 responses, half of them practical, 2 more panels at the North Ridge, 1 pump in the old marina needs a belt. The rest were questions, panic, offers, and threats. The last 2 were the worst. One caller said they could guarantee a convoy and demanded water in exchange up front. The other whispered I should keep the news to myself and offered payment if I did. The radio, as always, turned the private into the public in a heartbeat. That public pulled at our small community like fingers trying to pluck a string that might snap. 2 things compounded the tension. The dust storm chewed at our stores, and the raiders grew bolder. Raiders are not a homogeneous thing. Some were petty thieves, kids with bad training and worse aim. Others were organized, wearing the scars of too many small wars, moving in bands that had learned to survive on the peripheries of every enclave. The latter group learned quickly that a broadcast that mentions a working pump makes a place vulnerable. They began to test our fences in new ways. The first raid came like a procrastinated decision. We heard them before we saw them, the clink of a crowbar, the soft crunch of shoes on gravel, the low voices that belonged to people who hadn't spoken in years except to shout commands. Someone tripped a tin can on the outside line. The sound bellied over fields and made the watch shift. I manned a small lamp at the window and watched shadows move like broken kites. 5 men in patched jackets moved to the west gate. One of them carried a rifle with a folding stock. They were younger than I expected. Our perimeter was not a fort. It was a collection of hope and proof. Tripwires, a watch, the polite law that said if you come between dusk and dawn, we will not shoot first. The first man at the gate had the nerve to smile. "We don't want trouble," he said. "When someone with a rifle smiles, it is a promise that has been pre-delivered. We negotiated like bartering for bread. I offered rice. Ramon offered a length of hose and an alternator part. I saw the rifle twitch when I closed the crate. It is a ridiculous, sharp motion, like the twitch in an old dog when you mention thunder. The leader, tall, with a scar that looked like a seam running down his cheek, said they needed diesel. They needed it urgently. Their convoy was grounded and they were running out. It felt like a play, a theater that everyone knew their lines to. I handed them a pint, just one, and they left angry and satisfied, like a flea that had sworn off restraint after a bite. When they left, the tall leader looked back and said, quietly, "We'll be back." He said it like a weather forecast. When men say we'll be back, it is not always a threat. Sometimes it is a timetable. The problem is it is a promise you can't cash without loss. After that night, watch shifts lengthened and patience shortened. Ramon wanted to organize a precautionary strike, find their camp, scare them. He argued that deterrence works. Leave a marker, a dead goat, something that proves strength. I argued for caution. Fights pull fuel and attention away from kids and seeds. Elise, who has the steadiness of someone who has taught hyperactive children to thread needles for crafts, said we should make a clear list of non-negotiables and communicate. Water is life. Medicine is sacred. Children cannot be traded. Her voice carried weight because she spoke from the moral store we still operated from. But survival does not care for morals when hunger sits in your belly. 2 nights later, a different band tried a more direct approach. They came at us with smoke. Someone on the perimeter, a thin, wiry kid named Jeb, saw the glint of a lamp between the trees and set off the alarm. Tripwires sang. We lit the external bonfires that produce a smell of rot and worked to create a stink that drives animals to move away. And in doing so, we bought our people time. The raiders broke off when they realized the perimeter would not yield an easy prize. They aimed at our water bag over the pump instead, punctured it with a steel spike, and left us with a slow leak. When we discovered it the next morning, the cistern sounded like a jawbone. Repairing the hose meant sending Ramon back to the highway and asking for parts. The thought of letting him go made every one of us ill with the arithmetic of possibility. If he came back, we fixed the pump. If he did not, we rationed tighter and tried to stretch a few weeks into a month of survival. Ramon read the ledger and looked at us. "I'm going," he said, "because some people are wired to do the dangerous thing. If I don't come back, tell them I tried." The thing about danger in this world is that it is banal. People die in small ways. Infection, a bad fall, an argument that becomes a fist and then a gun. It is all unromantic, but the worst is the slow death of the collective will. I could feel it like a neighbor who has stopped coming to the morning watch. When someone misses that ritual, the house misses a part of its structure. The rumor of the keepers troubled me beyond the immediate tactical worries. There was a sweeter, more insidious danger to it. The possibility that someone would latch on to it, not to save a community, but to convert it into influence. Power is the real currency left. Control the pumps, control the margin between hunger and fullness. I have seen communities reorganize around a pump, leaders become coroners by decree. I have seen fraternal bonds turn into client-patron ties and then into indenture. There was also a mystery hidden under the rumor that bothered me. A caller, anonymous and breathless, sent a short audio clip on the frequency. A recording of water running through pipework, the kind of sound that is both promise and provocation. The clip had been compressed and resent so many times the high end had gone, but the sound lingered. Water, moving, purposeful. It made my chest both tight and bright. If the keepers were a hoax, then someone was recording trick water and resenting it for sport. If they were real, they had found a way to run a desalination system with the scarce parts available. I started to pry at what I could on air without giving away our exact location. I asked listeners for technical specifics. How are you powering it? I asked. What are your maintenance protocols? Who runs it? The replies were a stew of competence and fantasy. One engineer replied that a solar-driven membrane system was plausible if you could keep the profilters clean, and that reverse osmosis membranes last years if the feed water is properly pre-treated. He gave supplies lists, charcoal profilters, sediment housings, a high-pressure pump, and signatures. Names of traders who sometimes moved that equipment. Someone else scrawled the name Grayford with a map fragment. Another voice, older and hoarser, said the keepers were not purely technical, they were religious, and that made the prospect of negotiation dangerous. The tension grew like mold, unseen until it blooms. We made plans half hopeful and half practical. If Grayford existed, how many of us would go verify it? Who would drive? Who would guard? How many liters of diesel would we risk burning to find out? I sat with the ledger and circled numbers, until the circle looked like a bruise. A trip to Grayford would take a minimum of 4 days, 2 if the roads held, and a one-way path meant we might not have resources to return if something went wrong. The moral questions began to pile on other moral questions. If we knew where water was and kept it to ourselves, would that be theft? If we told everyone and a greedy band came, would we be responsible for feeding them? If we joined the keepers, would we be absorbed into their doctrine? I could feel myself getting tired of hypotheticals. Fatigue narrows the mind and hardens choices. Then a different kind of problem arrived. Internal erosion. A few people in our enclave, the ones who had grown used to my broadcasts as ritual, started to desire a change. They wanted someone with stronger arms, someone who could promise to carry more weight and take less counsel. These are the people who believe decisive leadership is a person with a plan. I understood. Men and women like that have kept small groups alive for centuries. They simply did it in ways that concentrated power. I listened to their arguments and found them persuasive in the way hunger makes any argument persuasive. They wanted a lead for the Grayford trip, a leader with a gun and a plan to secure any water found. I could have claimed the role, but I felt ill-suited. My hands are better at mending the alternator than swinging a rifle. I could have used the role to build authority. Instead, I proposed an assembly, a list of necessary skills, a rotation, and a protocol for sharing. It is not leadership that thrills the heart, but it is the sort of administrative stew that keeps a community functioning. Ramon returned just before dawn on the third day. He had a belt and a length of braided hose, and a story of a road where a convoy had been burned. He smelled of diesel and dust, and of the fear of someone who had been near men with longer scars than his own. He had also found a man, a lonely welder living in an industrial shell, who had mentioned a place called Grayford and pointed north. He came back with a battered map, made of tape and memory, and he came back with a small, fragile thing. A photograph, color-faded, of a smiling woman holding a child in front of a small building with a sign that read in half the ink, Ford. That photograph was enough to tilt us. We made a plan because the alternative was paralysis. 18 liters of diesel, a trailer, a small solar pack for emergency charging, Ramon's alternator, Hannah's list of seeds to save, and Elise's medical satchel. We would take Jeb for speed and his knack for slipping through fences. We would leave the children under a system of rotating watches and promises that if we saw smoke on the horizon we would radio back. We set a departure time, 2 hours before dawn, when the wind is least and the road is cooler. When you assemble for something like this you do small rituals. Pockets emptied of sentimental things no one can carry except memory, a coin placed in the pack for luck, a promise repeated 3 times, and then once more in case the first 2 were cursed. I gave Hannah my father's old watch, not because it told better time, but because someone else should have a thing that kept ticking. I put the cracked postcard with the lighthouse into Ramon's hand and told him to keep it for luck. When we left, the dust was already thinning in the air like a bruise healing. The sun would be up in 2 hours. We walked past the sanctuary, the church with its pew shelves and the seedlings wrapped in cloth, and I felt like I had defrauded the place by leaving it empty of my voice for more than 4 dawns. I put the radio transmitter in the pack with extra tubes and a note. Keep broadcasting the basic weather and lists. Keep channels open for others to call. The radio could not fix a pump, but it could warn others if the road went hot. We set out into a sky that smelled like iron. The road ahead was a memory of pavement crusted with salt and the occasional stick of asphalt that still remembered being smooth. We did not yet know if the keepers were salvation or blood. We only knew if we did not look, the rumor would metastasize and likely destroy more than it could save. The air tasted of challenge. My hands itched to hold the mic, to turn and talk for the sanctuary. I did not. For once, the story I needed to tell had to be lived rather than spoken. The rising action is not a single thunderclap. It is a slow tightening of a strap. We had strapped on our packs. We had closed the ledger. We had argued and decided and packed. The dust storm was a day behind us. Raiders were a day nearer. The rumor of Grayford hung like a compass needle that might point to a haven or a spear. I walked into the light knowing only this. To survive, we must sometimes travel toward the unknown and trust, for a handful of miles, the other people who carry our lives with us. We reached Grayford with the road still warm under our boots and the dust in our throats like a memory we couldn't cough out. The sign was half rotted, the letters gone in the center so it read only as a jagged promise. Ford. Beyond it, the estuary sat shallow and salt-scummed, and a ring of panels flashed like a stubborn handful of suns. A web of piping ran from a concrete trough down into a fenced compound, where a handful of buildings clustered like survivors clinging to one another. From a distance it looked small and deliberate, the way a hand closes on something it will not let go of. Up close it smelled like diesel and algae and boiled metal. Men stood at the gate with rifles, and with that look that says, "You have crossed an invisible line by stepping into their air." The leader met us with a clipboard and a patience that felt like a weapon. He was older than the raiders, clean-shaven, and his eyes had the calculating warmth of someone who had had to be cruel to be kind, and then found it didn't help. "We're the keepers," he said, and the name landed like an answer and an accusation at the same time. "We run a reverse osmosis set and a small distillation rig. We trade spare parts and labor for water. You came a long way." We told the simple version of the truth. Our cistern leaking, a wounded community, rumors on the air, a photograph that looked like hope. He listened without interrupting, then gestured for Ramon to show the photograph. Ramon's hands trembled as if the picture could be burned by touch. He held it out and the man's brow furrowed. "We can help," the keeper said, finally. "We can provide a limited allotment if you give us a schedule and labor. We are not a charity. We are fragile." He looked at me then, as if testing whether my voice could be trusted to carry orders back to a handful of people who had not yet seen the compound. "We can't support caravans. We can't support lending water to every roomer. We have to ration." That was the practical part. The moral ledger followed like a shadow. He had rules, signatures scratched into a ledger, hours of repair work owed for every 100 liters received, and a fence around the pump with a guard rotation. There was a quiet dignity to the way they ran things. Profilters changed on schedule, membranes flushed and cleaned with acid baths the way a priest cleans chalice. They had a woman with a scar on her forearm who kept the chemistry notes in a battered notebook. They had panels wired into a bank of batteries and a diesel genhead for the high-pressure pump. It was, in short, the thing we had hoped for and the thing we feared. We were negotiating when the first shots rang out. They came like punctuation in a sentence that had been written in haste. Raiders, not our petty thieves but a band that smelled of stolen mourning and old iron, had crawled through a narrow gap in the marsh and found the compound's southern flank. They moved fast, sliding across the low grass like predators that had learned to walk on water. The keeper's men moved to meet them. The small battle was ugly and clumsy. Smoke, gunfire, a sudden scream that made the air seem thin. My hands went numb the way grief goes numb. A protective mechanism, then a betrayal. I had a choice in that moment that pitched everything I was into a knife edge. Keep my mouth closed and let Grayford fight its own war, or use the one asset I still had that could alter the geometry of the conflict, the radio. To broadcast their coordinates was to risk every community that might hear, including ours. To stay silent was to gamble that the keepers were strong enough and that the raiders would be sated and move on. Both choices had the same moral charge. They would cost lives or dignity or both. I chose the thing I had always chosen in the smaller decisions, to speak. I dragged Ramon to a vantage point and handed him the portable set. "Get the generator up," I said. He moved like a man whose hands had done this 1,000 times. I found a frequency, not the open one but a code channel the keepers had given to trusted traders. I keyed the mic and thought of the sanctuary and the seedlings, and of Hannah's face when she first saw the photograph. I opened the circuit and let my voice go into the static. "This is Miles Harrington," I said, and the name felt like a life jacket in my mouth. "Grayford is under attack. Raiders from the south. They are trying to breach the pump compound. Any nearby stations, please respond. We need bodies, not bullets, help to secure the southern flank and medical support for the wounded. Repeat, Grayford under attack." It was an invitation and a beacon. On the air, the words don't carry the weight of wings. They are thin and human. Still, a voice responded from 3 counties over, a station I had only once exchanged seeds with. "Copy, Miles. We're north 2 hours. We'll move." Another came, a voice I recognized, a teacher who'd lost a village but kept a radio license. She said, "Hold them. Don't let the pump fall." The network, fragile and scattering, that I had been stitching with trivial broadcasts and lists of trade offers answered like a muscle reflex. That was the turning point. It didn't mean salvation arrived in time. The raiders pushed harder when they realized the compound would not yield easily, and the clash turned louder, more blunt. A man with a bandolier fell near the east wall, and the smell of blood mixed with diesel in a way that made me stumble. The keeper's men began to falter as their ammunition thinned. The leader looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the arithmetic of scarcity. Hold or lose the pumps, and the surrounding region succumbs to thirst. "We can't hold it," he said low. "Not without the generator running in continuous for the pump and more men. For the pump to run, we needed diesel for the gen head. A lot of diesel. Grayford's battery bank could keep the system humming for a little while, but the high-pressure pump eats energy like a living thing eats breath. The practical choice was to shear the feed and save the machinery from damage. The moral one was to power the pump and flood the compound with water, buying time and perhaps making the raiders think the place was more valuable as an ally than as a conquest. Both choices would use fuel, and both would risk the machinery and the people. I thought of the church, of the cistern that had thudded thin, of the children who learned to count by cups. I thought of the ledger and the photograph, and of the name list I read on the air every week. I thought of the people who had answered my calls in the past with spare filters and a wrench and a word. This was not the time to calculate only survival for my small circle. "Run the pump," I said. There was a ripple of disbelief. Running the pump meant we would burn through their diesel stores, and our caravan's emergency leaders would go into the fire. It meant the genhead could fail if the belts overstrained, and if it failed the membranes would clog and the system might be ruined. It meant that even if we won the skirmish, there might be no power left to keep it running tomorrow. It meant sacrifice on a scale that made me taste metal. "Run the pump," I said again, softer, because orders sounded like prayers when you were not a priest. "Run it long enough to give them a ration. Flood the waiting tanks. If they see water flowing, they may leave. If they see enough for the neighbors, they may take trade instead of taking." The keeper flipped switches with the rapidity of someone who had practiced this exact dance. The genhead coughed, then roared a difficult, obscene sound more like a beast than a machine. The high-pressure pump started with a shudder and a metallic song. Water, green and brackish and miraculous, began to fill the overhead tanks. For a moment, everything smelt like victory and diesel and salt. The raiders had expected to arrive and empty the place. Instead, they found hands and faces, and the strange human thing of cooperation. When people see a pump run and water drawn into tanks, they see not only the immediate value but the social difficulty of taking it. If you take it, you must defend it. If you defend it, you must change your hunger into a duty. Sometimes that thought deters thieves, sometimes it enrages them. They attacked anyway. The battle sharpened, then blurred. I did what I could, moved wounds aside, hauled a line to reroute overflow, shouted orders that were more to keep people moving than to be useful. At one point, a raider slipped through and aimed at the keeper's woman with the chemistry pad. I threw myself between them without thinking and felt the hot sting of a grazing wound along my forearm. Someone dragged me back. Blood ran and my skin fizzed where the dust met it. I tasted iron. I felt very small and very human. Then the help I had called for, the neighbors who had heard my voice, arrived in a crooked column. Battered trucks, bicycles with panniers. A couple of solitary riders who looked like they had come because a man with a mic had asked. They moved like a community that had been woken and told that something mattered. Raiders, without the surprise on their side and now facing a swarm of people who had chosen to respond rather than watch from distance, began to falter. The tall leader with the seam down his cheek swore and wheeled his men. They retreated into the marsh like a tide going out when you clap your hands hard enough. When the smoke cleared, the pumps still ran. Men and women stood with arms shaking and faces streaked with soot and tears. The keeper's ledger was open on a crate where someone had fallen against it. Signatures had dried into the paper. We had water in tanks, and the sound of it, that soft, steady movement, seemed to push the panic out of people with the same gentle pressure. But it was not a clean victory. The genhead had shuddered and used a great measure of diesel. The battery bank had drained more than expected. 2 panels had been slit by a thrown blade. Ramon's alternator smoked where an ember had found it. We had saved the pump and filled tanks, but we had also used resources that could break tomorrow. And that was a gamble I had made for a principle rather than for a calculation. I had chosen the communal good and now had to live with the cost. Standing in the compound, forearm bandaged and hands smelling of diesel and blood, I felt a hollow, expansive thing open inside me, not relief but a recognition. The air between being and having is a thin wire, and I had walked it and found my balance because a network of voices had answered mine. My promise to speak had become a lever. The keeper clasped my shoulder with a weighty hand. "You made a radio call," he said. "Not everyone would. Most would keep their mouths shut to protect their own. You put yourself at risk." I had a sanct. The word wanted to be sanctuary, but the church was miles away. "Promise to speak," I said. My voice sounded like someone distant. "It's dangerous to speak, but worse to be silent when people need to know." He nodded. "We can run an allotment. We can train some of you in basic membrane care. We need people who will learn the profilters and keep them clean. We need people who understand ligation for the women and that the dissal brine must be disposed of carefully. Trades will be required. We are not a fortress. We are an economy that depends on trust. Trust." The word felt like a fragile thing you could either keep in your palm or let fly. I thought of Hannah, of Elise teaching stitches, of the children counting cups. I thought of the sanctuary and the ledger, and the names I read aloud that kept memory bright against the dark. That night, we sat around tanks that clinked and breathed with the slow mechanical sound of life being preserved. The sky was a bruise but quieter, the dust had settled. I sent a short broadcast, this time not a call for help but a report. Grayford secure, pumps running, ration plan in place, requests for filters and for a welder. Voices answered offers and questions and the small human noise of people making plans. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of a siren began, a different kind of voice, perhaps a patrol, perhaps a warning. I held the mic and let the static fill the edges of the night. The climax was not a single decision that fixed everything. It was a set of choices that tilted the immediate danger and exposed the cost. Fuel spent, panels scarred, lives risked. But it also revealed an essential truth I had been rehearsing for months in little broadcasts and ledger entries. The radio, the voice, is an instrument of communal action. To use it is to accept responsibility for what follows. When I finally curled up on a bench in the compound, forearm throbbing, I thought of the photograph Ramon had carried, and of the list of names I keep. I thought of my family and the convoy that never returned, and of the child whose letter I read last week about a dead pigeon. I could console myself with the mathematics of the choice. Water for the many, diesel spent, but lives saved. That is cold comfort. The warmer truth was primal and stubborn. We had stood together, we had used our voices to call for help, and help had come. The turning point had broken and remade me. I had always believed that speaking the truth was a moral act. I had not fully understood that speaking might be the most practical tool we had left. The radio had turned a rumor into a rescue and a pump into a promise. It had also widened the ledger of responsibility. Tomorrow would bring other choices. How to train more hands, how to ensure the fuel wasn't looted, how to keep neighbors from collapsing under the weight of need. The crisis had not ended. It had sharpened. But in the pool of water that glowed under the compound lights, something measured and small and irrevocable had changed. For the first time in months, I had seen how voices could be counted as a resource, how community, not isolation, scaled better in a world that was unmaking itself. I had chosen to be loud when silence felt safer, and that choice, noisy, dangerous, terribly human, had kept a pump running and a few more people breathing. The morning after, the world was quieter but not kinder. The air had that brittle, washed smell you get after rain that isn't quite clean diesel and smoke, and the faint, sweet rot of disturbed marsh. We slept in shifts on benches and crates, eyes catching at every small motion. At dawn the pump still hummed, and the sound of water moving was a balm I could not have described before I needed it. It filled the waiting tanks in a measured, mechanical way, as if the machine itself were administering a small mercy. The immediate outcome of the choice to run the pump was obvious and complicated. Grayford's tanks filled. People drank. A nurse from a neighboring enclave was able to bathe a man whose arm had been torn and begin proper wound care. Children who had been listless and glassy-eyed from dehydration warmed and began to ask the small, insistent questions that mean someone plans to stay. What will we plant? Who will watch the pumps tonight? Where is the extra sugar? For the first time in weeks, some faces around the compound softened. The geometry of need changed, for a few days at least. Water was not a knife pressed against every decision, but the ledger recorded costs like a ledger always must. The generator's diesel was down by several days' worth, more than Grayford could comfortably spare without risking the system's long-term function. 2 panels had been damaged in the scuffle. Their glass had been scored in a way that reduced output. Ramon's alternator smoked and needed a rewind, a job that would take a welder and skill, and parts we did not have in abundance. Back at the sanctuary, our cistern had survived the puncture, but it had leaked enough to shave days off our buffer. The math that keeps life going still required subtraction. The raiders retreated, but their threat remained endemic. They had learned the location of a small, functioning desalination plant now. That knowledge spreads like mold. It made us strategize differently. More watches, convoy protocols for getting supplies in and out, trade rules that required prearranged couriers rather than open caravans. We set up a small rotation. 2 men to maintain the southern approach, 2 to tend the profilters, 2 to check membrane integrity, and a volunteer for liaison to the keeper compound, so that miscommunications didn't become combat. I wrote these roles into the ledger and read them on air, so other enclaves could model similar safeguards. The act of publicizing our plan felt risky and necessary. Risk because others could exploit the knowledge, necessary because secrecy had been what allowed raids to prey on ignorance. There was a cost to being loud. A week after the battle, someone in a convoy we had trusted diverted a shipment of brackets intended for Grayford and sold them to a trader passing through. We found out because the trader was careless with his pride and called them a useful score. The theft was a ritual reminder that not everyone we thought we had tethered by mutual aid would hold. Some people are tethered only by their immediate advantage. It hardened us in the ways that fatigue hardens, but there were also returns on the risk. The welder the keeper had enlisted came to our sanctuary and spent 3 full days coaxing Ramon's alternator back to life, with improvised windings from old transformer coils. He refused pay at first, then accepted a crate of dried beans and a promise of medical attention should he need it. The community network answered in surprising human ways. A caravan, small, careful, led by a woman who used to run municipal water for a small college, offered to show a few of us how to maintain membrane integrity and to organize a preventive maintenance schedule. We traded them labor and a promise. When their child fell ill, we would prioritize medicine procurement. Trade reasserted itself as something more than barter. It was a web. Inside me, the most durable shift was in how I understood my role. The radio had been, for months, an instrument of reporting and minor triage. That night in the compound made it a sword and a balm at once. I now felt the weight of being a voice in a world where voices can move people like weather. I had, in a few broadcasts, redirected scarcity, encouraged generosity, and invited risk. That felt both powerful and terrible. Power is a dirty thing when you deal in lives. I found myself rehearsing the language of caution before I spoke. Who benefits? Who pays? What is the likely cost? I kept a small notebook of ethics under the microphone now, little questions I ran through like prayers. Does this save lives? Does this expose others to risk? The notebook was an attempt to make the ephemeral gravity of speech into something I could manage. Emotionally, I was not lighter. There were nights the memory of my family, the laughter frozen in a photograph on my mat, the child with jam on his lip, folded over the new attachments and made me feel like a fraud. I had chosen to risk other people's dazzle for the communal good, while I had once failed to find the convoy that carried my own. Guilt is a stubborn coat. I wore it when the nights were too cold, and the reasons for keeping going thin to thread. But guilt also sharpened into purpose in small ways. I visited each of the wounded, learning their names slowly, asking the caretaker to teach me what she knew about the wounds so I could be useful beyond radio. Practical usefulness is a form of expiation I can live with. The environmental arc remained stubbornly cruel. A week after our victory, a heat dome pushed north and scorched 3 enclaves' rooftop gardens before anyone could save them. The climate does not pause for human drama. In places, there were small, almost private recoveries. A creek lined with sedges that had begun to drink again where someone had dug a shallow infiltration trench. A stand of willows in a marsh that had held through the storms. But these were pockets, not trends. The larger systems, aquifers, jet streams, weather patterns, did not reboot because a pump started. We lived under a new normal of punctuated resource availability, sudden abundance followed by stricter scarcity. The pump was a lifeline, not a fix. We began the slow work of institutionalizing the win. The keepers agreed to a formal allotment schedule and to train 4 of our people in membrane care. We sent Ramon, Hannah, Elise, and young Jeb north for a month-long apprenticeship. Sending them felt like sending family across a narrow sea, but if knowledge could be implanted in more hands, then fragility could become resilience. We drafted a communal charter that was as much about ethics as logistics. No unilateral withholding of knowledge about water sources, mandatory rotation for the medical tent, a council to adjudicate disputes that touches on rationing, and a rule that any external convoy must be verified by 2 independent channels before opening gates. The charter was not perfect. It was not written on loss so much as on hope and the practical pressure of survival. It used words like "we" in a way that felt radical in a world where I had been the original currency. The effort of creating the charter, debating it in candlelight, and reading it aloud on the radio felt like making a small act of civilization, messy, argumentative, and necessary. Hope settled into me like sediment. It was not bright. It was practical. It smelled like solder and boiled water and the precise geometry of a properly torqued clamp. It was visible in the small things. A child who had learned to collect condensation from a tarp and was now proud of her 2 jars. An elder who showed a trick to keep beetles from eating seedlings. A neighbor who sent over a jar of homemade pickles in trade for a lesson on filter maintenance. Those are the threads that stitch days into something like a life. There were losses too. 2 men from a small enclave that had attempted to rush in and take water without offering tools were caught and tried by the Keepers' Council. They had been desperate and short-sighted. Their punishment was not death but exile, which in this world can be the same thing. One of them left with a small pack and a look in his eyes that said he expected to die alone. We heard later they had been taken by a band with worse habits. Later still, a note reached us, a quickly scribbled message sent through 3 hands, that one of the exiles had been found and helped by a group that ran a mobile clinic. That was the strange geometry of this world. Acts of brutality often braided into small mercies. Nothing fits cleanly. By the time we returned to the sanctuary, the seedlings were alive and squinty, like babies brought back from near death and blinking in new light. People had shown up to help patch the panels. The welder returned, now more friend than contractor. We put together a small repair kit and a plan for hauling panels to Grayford for periodic maintenance. The ledger increased not only in debts but in promises. 2 hours of membrane cleaning in exchange for 5 liters of water. A day's welding for a sack of flour. Promises in our world had become currency nearly as trustworthy as coins. I continue to read names from the shelf each week. The ritual remains, a tether to memory, and a public accounting of who we keep in mind. I still have dreams where I am following a convoy down a road that dissolves, and my family is just beyond my sight. In the morning, the dreams sit in my chest like a stone that needs shaping. But the radio taught me something practical about grief. If you name it, you make space for others to answer. Someone always does. The aftermath is not a neat bow but a long, slow thread. The pump at Grayford buys time and provides a node of stability. It does not change the climate or refill the emptied aquifers. It does not unlearn the decades of extraction that left basins hollow. What it does is show that pockets of cooperation can scale into networks, that technology married to labor and trust can be more durable than brute force. We have to keep teaching and fixing and trading and arguing. We have to keep reading names aloud. What changed within me is not a grand revelation but a practical reorientation. I speak with more care because I now measure the weight of my words. I have less appetite for false hope and more for tactical optimism, the kind that plans, repairs, and trains. I am less likely to make promises I cannot keep, and more likely to bring someone with me who can. I feel responsibility more acutely, and that responsibility sometimes presses like a bruise. But it also steadies me. The world outside keeps its old ruthlessness. It will still hurl dust storms and heat domes and human cruelty at us. Some nights I lie awake and calculate how long our stores will last if a convoy is lost, or if a second band returns. Those calculations are grim, and they shape our actions. Yet there is water in tanks now, and a network that answers my voice. There are people who have learned a membrane's temper and children who know how to save condensation. Those small, practical victories are not consolation prizes. They are the scaffolding of a possible future. So we keep the ledger open and the radio warm. We mend what we can, we teach what we can, we guard what we must. The event that changed everything was not a single victory, but the collective choice to act, to risk, and to teach. Hope lives in small acts now, in a welded alternator, in a clean filter, in a name read and answered. The world is not healed. It is still starving in many places. But for a few hundred people clustered around tanks and panels, the immediate horizon is less hungry than it was a fortnight ago. If that is a small mercy, then we will take it and press it into our hands and use it to build the next small mercy. The ledger will keep a running total. We will keep reading the names. We will keep the radio humming. We will keep breathing. The world does not close chapters anymore. It edits them with a blunt hand, rips out pages, smudges lines, then hands you what remains and asks you to read it aloud as if the punctuation still matters. I have learned to live with that raggedness. I have learned that endings are dishonest in a place that keeps surprising you with small cruelties and smaller mercies. So this is not an ending. It is a pause at the side of the road where I set down my pack for a minute and try to describe what we carry. After Grayford, after the pump and the smoke and the hands that came when I called, life resumed its arithmetic. We patched 2 panels and lost a belt. We trained Ramon in membrane cleaning and taught Jeb how to prime a profilter without gagging. We sealed the cistern and promised to recheck it every 3 nights. None of these acts are grand. They are the quiet, repetitive work that keeps people alive. They are the stitches in a garment we wear to keep warm. They are also the thing that keeps me from drowning in what-ifs. Hope, in this shape of life, is not a rising crescendo. It is not a sudden sunburst or a miraculous reversal. It is small, domestic, stubborn. It is a child who learns to trap morning dew in a plastic sheet and counts the drops with a solemn pride that makes the rest of us grin like idiots. It is the keeper's woman showing Hannah how to test the brine concentration, and Hannah teaching her how to turn scrap wood into a raised bed. It is two communities that used to trade suspicious glances at a crossroads now scheduling a mutual maintenance day. It is a soldered alternator that hums in someone's hands that can fix it again next month. Yet hope is fragile because it relies entirely on acts that can be snapped. A convoy rerouted by greed, a panel slashed by a bored hand, a fever that takes a child because antibiotics ran dry. The same network that made Grayford's rescue possible is also a web that can tangle and tear. Every time I turn the microphone on, I weigh the balance between telling truth and inviting trouble. I do not always choose rightly. I have misjudged. People have paid. Those errors are not abstract. They live in the ledger and in the hollow where someone's laughter used to be. I keep the ledger because memory is a moral muscle. Naming what we owe to people, to promises, to mistakes, is how we stay accountable. I have changed. The man who used to think of himself as a reporter, a voice that narrated weather and trades, now feels the strange burden of being a facilitator, a conduit for actions that change lives. That has made language heavier. I pause more. I check the numbers twice. I ask myself who benefits and who pays. I have become less an oracle and more a clerk of consequences. There is humility in that. There is also fear. The fear is practical. We still count diesel in teaspoons. We still ration water like a hymn. The climate is indifferent to ethics. Heat domes will come, and dust storms will carve new maps across the land. Aquifers will not refill overnight. There will be more raids, more nights when a man with a rifle will smile and tell you they don't want trouble, which is another way of saying they want your things in your sleep. The future will require more labor than miracles. It will require training, patience, and the spreading of small skills until a dozen hands can do what one expert once alone could. So what do I ask of you, of anyone listening? First, keep the practical things alive. Seed saving is not sentimental, it is strategy. Teaching someone to change a filter is not small, it is a life skill. If you have a battery, share the circuitry diagrams. If you have a skill, teach it until the next person can do it without you watching. Knowledge is the only kind of surplus that compounds rather than decays. Second, protect what is humane. Keep your lists of names. Read them aloud. When someone answers, do not treat their voice as a commodity. Treat it like a membrane, something that keeps the essential running between people. Third, be careful with your words. A broadcast can be a lifeline or a lure. We are responsible for the echoes we send into the air. If you are tempted to despair, I know the ache. I have learned the geometry of that feeling. It curls in the chest and insists that nothing will change. Despair is honest but not strategic. It is a heat that saps work into apathy. The better, more dangerous choice is to let grief live where it needs to, and then to fold it into a small, stubborn action. Plant a scrap of lettuce. Mend a strap. Teach a child to check the cistern. One tiny, purposeful repair is a defiance against the scale of ruin. There is also a moral calculus that we cannot avoid. When resources are finite, who gets the water? How do we choose between a stranger and a child? These are ugly questions, and we answer them badly and then try again. We try to build fairer systems, rotating watch shifts, public ledgers of trades, councils to adjudicate disputes. They are imperfect, but they are better than autocracy or blind self-preservation. When I, as a voice, called for help and people came, it was not because I had authority. It was because I had cultivated trust. Trust is the resource we must invest in if anything is to scale. The truth is simple and bitter. We cannot fix the climate in our lifetimes. We cannot refill aquifers overnight. We cannot make the jet stream obedient. The scale of the collapse is larger than any one community or even a network of communities. But what we can do is make pockets of resilience. We can build nodes of water, pockets of seed, centers of knowledge that are redundancies in the network. Those redundancies matter because they reduce single points of catastrophic failure. That is the practical arc of hope available to us. So I will keep the radio warm. I will keep the ledger open. I will read names aloud and fix what I can fix. I will trade knowledge for wrenches and stitches for time. I will teach someone to mend a profilter until the movement is second nature. I will keep a list of the people who have helped us and the people we owe. And I will, when I have spare words, tell stories, small human stories, because they stitch people together in a way recipes and bulletins do not. If you hear this, know that I am not asking for blind optimism. I am not pretending we will all live like kings in a recovered world. I am asking for the stubborn, practical kind of courage that shows up at dawn and checks panels for dust. I am asking you to be small and powerful, teach, mend, share. Keep a candle for memory and a wrench for tomorrow. The world is a ravaged instrument. We are the ones who keep tuning it, not to its original pitch but to a sustainable key. It is slow, and sometimes nothing seems to change at all. But when you find a pump that runs another week, when you coax a vine through a summer and harvest a tomato that tastes faintly of the old world, you will know the difference between mere surviving and making a life worth living. I do not know what tomorrow holds. I only know this. We have learned that voices matter, that knowledge compounds, and that small acts aggregate into something durable. We will keep breathing, counting, trading, and teaching. That is not noble. It is necessary. Stay alive. Stay human. Keep the radio warm.